The hospital corridor was unnaturally silent. Late at night, the cold, white lights reflected off the polished floors like a mirror. A trauma patient was rushed in, unconscious, struggling for air, his pulse a frantic rhythm. His file was a ghost. No full name, no history, just a blank sheet of paper. Maya, the lead nurse, stepped in. The doctor shouted, "Stabilize him first. We'll sort the identity later." She nodded, following the protocol. But during the second check, she noticed a detail that didn't fit. She decided to hold him. The next morning, the Department of Defense called with one question. Everything changed after that. The emergency room at St. Jude's was a place where time was measured in heartbeats, and stories were often cut short by the hollow, high-pitched sound of a flatline. It was an environment of brutal efficiency, a triage of human suffering. Maya had recently transferred here, but she wasn't exactly a rookie. She had spent 4 long, grueling years in the intensive care unit, a place where every breath was a calculated victory and every milliliter of fluid was logged with surgical precision. In the ICU, you had the luxury of time, however fleeting. You lived with your patients. You knew the cadence of their sighs and the exact moment their bodies began to surrender. But the ER? The ER was a different beast entirely. It was loud, chaotic, and driven by a single, unyielding directive: speed. In the ER, the philosophy was simple: stabilize and move. There was no time for deep, philosophical dives into medical histories or pondering the complex why behind a wound. You patched the hole, you restarted the heart, you shocked the system back into some semblance of rhythm, and then you cleared the bed for the next siren wailing in the distance. Maya, however, struggled with this relentless mechanical rhythm. Her mind was naturally built for the details. She was the type of nurse who noticed things others dismissed as noise. She noticed the slight, translucent yellowing of a patient's fingernails that hinted at liver failure long before the blood work came back. She noticed the way a pulse skipped a beat, only when a patient was lying on their left side, suggesting a subtle structural heart defect that the monitors ignored. "You're moving too slow, Maya," Dr. Sterling had told her during her first week. Sterling was a veteran of the trauma bays, a man who could intubate a patient in the dark while reciting his grocery list. His movements were a blur of practiced reflex. In this ward, you don't get the luxury of double-checking everything. If the vitals are within the green zone on that monitor, they're stable. Trust the machine, Maya. Keep the line moving. We are a conveyor belt of survival. Maya tried her best to adapt. She pushed herself to work faster, to trust the digital readouts, and to stop asking the annoying questions that didn't lead to immediate stabilization. She practiced the art of the quick glance assessment, but her eyes, her traitorous, meticulous eyes, refused to cooperate. They were always searching for the anomaly. She kept seeing the things others ignored in the rush. One night, she noticed a slight, rhythmic tremor in an elderly patient's hand, a tremor that suggested a specific neurological toxicity rather than just the expected shock from a broken hip. Another time, she noticed the faint, acrid smell of a specific industrial chemical on a mechanic's skin, a smell that explained his sudden respiratory distress far better than any X-ray could. She had flagged it, and she had been right. But being right didn't earn her praise. In the high-velocity world of the ER, being right often meant you were slowing down the throughput. Her colleagues, though professional and respectful, began to see her as a bottleneck. They were all exhausted, pushed to the absolute breaking point by a chronic staffing shortage and a never-ending influx of patients from the city's rougher edges. They didn't have time for Maya's ICU habits. They needed someone who could clear the board and keep the waiting room from overflowing into the streets. "You don't have to prove you're the smartest person in the room, Maya," a senior nurse named Sarah whispered to her one night during a rare 3-minute coffee break. "Just do the job. The system is designed to handle the big stuff, the bleeding, the stopping of hearts, the broken bones, the small stuff. Well, in this environment, sometimes the small stuff just has to wait until they get to the floor." But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the small stuff was where the real truth lived. She had a history of catching the ghosts that others missed. Back in her ICU days, she had flagged a tiny medication error, a decimal point out of place, because she noticed a patient's pupils were just 1 millimeter more dilated than they should have been after a standard dose of pain relief. She was right, and she had saved a life. But instead of being thanked, she was told she was too focused on the minutia. As Act 1 drew to a close, Maya stood in the middle of a frantic midnight shift. The smell of ozone and disinfectant filled the air. She felt the heavy, crushing pressure to conform, to become just another efficient, unthinking gear in the massive machine of the emergency room. She began to believe that maybe Dr. Sterling was right. Maybe speed was the only true currency in this building. But her innate need for accuracy was like a splinter in her mind, small, annoying, and impossible to extract. She was a woman caught between two worlds, the frantic, reactive speed of the ER and the quiet, deep precision of her own conscience. The night shift was at its darkest, most hollow hour when the double doors burst open with a violent crash. The paramedics were shouting, their voices raw with the jagged urgency of a high-priority, red-tag trauma. On the gurney was a man in his mid-30s. His body was a grim canvas of bruising, lacerations, and deep tissue trauma. He had been found in a twisted wreckage on a remote road on the outskirts of the city. "No ID," the paramedic yelled as they executed a synchronized transfer to bed 3. No wallet, no phone, nothing in the vehicle. The registration was a dead end. "We're calling him John Doe for now. Multiple blunt force traumas to the torso, severe respiratory distress, possible internal hemorrhage. We had to bag him the whole way in." Dr. Sterling was already at the bedside, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a machine. "Maya, get him on the monitor immediately. Sarah, prep for a chest tube. We need to stabilize his breathing before he codes on us. Let's move." Maya moved with a speed that finally satisfied Sterling. She attached the ECG leads, her eyes scanning the man's body as she worked. On the monitor, he was a standard trauma. His vitals were dangerously low but slowly stabilizing as the fluids hit his system. His oxygen saturation was climbing back toward the 90% mark. According to the protocol, he was being handled perfectly. He was a success story in the making. But as Maya used a damp cloth to clean the dried blood and road grime from his left shoulder, she stopped. Underneath the filth was a scar. It wasn't a jagged surgical scar, and it certainly wasn't the kind of messy mark left by a common accident. It was a small, perfectly puckered mark, the kind left by a high-velocity projectile that had been surgically removed with extreme professional precision. She paused, her cloth hovering over the skin. Then she looked at his hands. They weren't the soft hands of an office worker, nor the rough, calloused hands of a typical laborer. The calluses were in highly specific places, the heavy webbing between the thumb and forefinger, and the hardened pads of the palms. These were the hands of someone who spent thousands of hours handling specialized high-recoil equipment. "Maya, focus! I need those vitals recorded in the system now," Sterling snapped, not looking up from the chest tube he was inserting. "Doctor, look at his physique," Maya said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "His muscle density is far above the civilian average. His resting heart rate, even while in a state of severe shock, is unnaturally low. And this scar on the shoulder, it looks like a gunshot wound that was repaired in the field by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Sterling barely glanced over, his focus entirely on the sound of air rushing into the man's lungs. "It doesn't matter who he is right now, Maya. It matters that he's breathing. We stabilize the patient first. Identity can wait until he's in a regular ward, and the social workers can run his prints. We have 3 more major traumas coming in from a multi-car pileup on the interstate. We need this bed cleared by 4 o'clock. Maya felt the pushback of the entire system. The protocol was a wall. If she pushed for more tests now, she would be throwing a wrench into the gears of the entire department. But her gut, that ICU-trained, detail-oriented gut, was screaming at her. While checking his personal effects, she noticed a small metallic object tucked into a hidden, reinforced pocket of his tactical-style belt. Something the paramedics had completely missed in their haste. It was a small, unmarked device. It looked like a tracking beacon, but one designed to be invisible to standard scanners. She didn't mention it to Sterling. He wouldn't care. He would see it as a distraction from the task of clearing the board. As the man finally stabilized, the automated system triggered the order to transfer him to the general surgical ward for recovery. It was a standard, routine move. He was safe. But as Maya looked at the telemetry monitor one last time, she noticed a flicker. It wasn't a heart rhythm. It was a tiny rhythmic anomaly in his brain activity, something that looked less like a concussion and more like a reaction to a highly specific type of neurostabilizer. If they transferred him now to a general floor, he would be monitored by a floor nurse who was likely handling 15 other patients. They wouldn't be looking for those subtle signals. They wouldn't notice if his pupils started to pinpoint. He would be just another John Doe recovering from a car wreck until he quietly stopped breathing. Maya stood by the gurney, the transfer papers in her hand. The digital signature was waiting for her touch. She saw Dr. Sterling already moving toward the next bay, his back turned. She saw the exhaustion in the eyes of her colleagues who were desperate for bed 3 to be empty. Everything in the system, the hospital, the protocol, the clock, was telling her to sign the paper and let him go. But then the man's hand twitched. It wasn't a random spasm of a traumatized muscle. It was a deliberate, controlled movement, a sequence of 3 sharp taps against the cold metal of the bed rail. Tap, 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 tap. It was a code. It was a signal for wait. In that moment, Maya made a choice that would define her career. She didn't sign the transfer. Instead, she deliberately flagged the patient for further neurological observation and moved him to a high-care observation bay, effectively blocking a critical bed that the ER desperately needed for the incoming trauma wave. "What on earth are you doing?" Sarah asked, coming over with a look of pure confusion. "Sterling gave the clear for transfer 20 minutes ago. If he finds out you held him back without a documented medical emergency, you're going to be in deep trouble. He might even report you to the board for insubordination." "I think the medical reasons are right in front of us," Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "We just haven't looked deep enough yet. I'm holding him. I'll take the heat." The decision to hold the patient caused an immediate jagged ripple of tension through the night shift. Dr. Sterling was livid when he returned and saw bed 3 still occupied. He stormed over to the high-care bay as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows. "Maya, I gave a clear direct order to transfer bed 3. We have people waiting in the hallway on stretchers, and you're tying up a critical care bed for a hunch? This isn't the ICU, Maya. You don't get to play detective here. I'm overriding your hold. Pack him up." "Doctor, I ran a specialized high-sensitivity toxicology screen while you were in the other bay," Maya said, standing her ground between the doctor and the patient. "And I requested a high-resolution scan of the old injury sites. I did it on my own authority. Look at the results before you move him." Sterling snatched the tablet from her hand, his eyes scanning the data with a skeptical sneer. Then he went deathly quiet. The toxicology report showed traces of a highly rare, experimental nerve agent stabilizer, something that wasn't available in any civilian hospital or research facility in the country. The scan of the shoulder showed not just a gunshot wound, but a micro-miniature titanium plate with a serial number that didn't match any known medical manufacturer. "Where did you even find a lab to test for this?" Sterling whispered, his anger replaced by a sudden, cold realization. "I looked at what didn't fit," Maya replied. "His body doesn't match the story of a car accident. He's been through a high-stakes extraction. If we had moved him to the general ward, his system would have crashed the moment that stabilizer wore off. Without the specific counter agent, he wouldn't have made it through the morning." Before Sterling could respond, the hospital's security director walked onto the floor, looking uncharacteristically pale. He was followed by 2 men in dark, tailored suits who didn't look like local police. They didn't look like FBI. They looked like ghosts. They walked straight to the high-care bay, ignoring the nurses and the confusion. "We're looking for a patient brought in as a John Doe from the Sector 4 wreckage," one of the men said. He didn't show a badge. He showed a specialized holographic clearance card with the Department of Defense seal. The hospital went into an immediate, silent lockdown. The John Doe was quickly identified in the secure system as a Navy SEAL, a Tier 1 operator who officially didn't exist in any public database. He had been missing for 48 hours following a denied area training exercise that had gone catastrophically wrong. The realization hit the trauma bay like a physical weight. The man they had almost pushed through the system like a piece of faulty equipment was a national asset. He wasn't just a patient. He was a person whose survival was a matter of extreme national security. Sometime around 9 o'clock, after the patient had been stabilized by a specialized military medical team that arrived by a blacked-out helicopter on the roof, Maya was called into the chief of medicine's office. Dr. Sterling was already there, sitting in a chair looking uncharacteristically quiet. He looked humbled. On the speakerphone was a representative from the Department of Defense. His voice was gravelly, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who dealt in life and death as a daily currency. "We understand that the patient was nearly transferred to a low-level observation ward," the voice said. "Our internal data indicates that had he been moved, the lack of specialized minute-to-minute monitoring would have resulted in a fatal respiratory collapse within 2 hours. He was on a timer we didn't share." The chief of medicine looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at his hands. The voice on the phone continued. "We have one question for this facility, one very specific question that our superiors are interested in." Maya felt her heart racing against her ribs. She fully expected a reprimand, a lecture for breaking the chain of command, for slowing down the ER, for being too focused on the minutiae at the expense of the hospital's efficiency. "Who made the call to hold him?" the DoD representative asked. "Who saw the indicators that our own high-tech sensors missed? Who made the decision to prioritize the subtle needs of the patient over the hospital's established efficiency protocol?" The chief of medicine cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "That would be Nurse Maya Lawson. She's one of our newer staff members, recently transferred from the ICU." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Tell Nurse Lawson that the United States Navy thanks her," the voice said, and for the first time, there was a trace of genuine respect in the gravel. She didn't just save a patient. She saved an operator who was vital to an ongoing mission. She saw the man, not the file. That kind of vision is rare in a system built for speed. The call ended. Maya walked out of the office and back into a hallway that somehow felt different. The white lights were the same. The smell of bleach and old floor wax was the same. But the way her colleagues looked at her had shifted. There were no cheers, no grand speeches. This was a world of silent professionals. But Dr. Sterling stopped her near the nursing station. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked at her. "I was wrong, Maya," he said simply. "I saw the line of patients. You saw the person in it. Don't ever let this place, or any doctor like me, take that away from you. We need your eyes." Maya didn't feel like a hero. She just felt like a nurse who had finally found her true place in the chaos. She realized that her ICU habits weren't a defect. They were her primary strength. In a world that wanted her to move fast, her greatest contribution to the world was the courage to slow down and look. The weeks following the event were surprisingly quiet. There were no medals handed out in the lobby, no press releases to the local papers, and certainly no mention of the Navy SEAL in any public record. The military had wiped the digital records clean before the sun had even set on that fateful day, leaving behind only a successful recovery and transfer note in the hospital's internal database. But the emergency room itself had changed in a way that was hard to put into words. It was subtle at first. A doctor would pause for an extra 10 seconds to look into a patient's eyes before ordering a discharge. A senior nurse would stop by Maya's station to ask her opinion on a weird feeling they had about a trauma case that looked fine on paper. The culture of stabilize and move hadn't disappeared. It couldn't, given the volume of the city's needs. But it was now balanced by a new quiet respect for the detail. Maya found herself becoming a mentor of sorts, even though she still felt like a newcomer. She began to teach the younger nurses how to look for the hidden stories that everybody tells. She taught them to look for the scars that didn't match the reported injury, the resting heart rates that suggested a history of high-performance training, and the subtle metallic smells that betrayed an environmental toxin. "You have to listen to what the patient isn't saying," she told a group of residents one rainy afternoon. "The machines are brilliant, but they don't know the difference between a car accident victim and a soldier. They don't know the difference between fear and pain. Only you can see that. You are the final filter." One night, as Maya was finishing a grueling, back-to-back 12-hour shift, she sat in the break room with a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee. She looked at her small, battered notebook, the same one where she used to write down the things that didn't fit. She thought back to that night with the SEAL. She thought about how close she had come to signing that transfer paper just to avoid a conflict with Dr. Sterling and to fit into the team. She realized that the most dangerous moment in her career hadn't been a medical crisis. It had been the moment she almost prioritized her own comfort and social standing over the patient's safety. A small package arrived for her at the hospital a few days later. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside was a simple blackened challenge coin. On one side was a Navy SEAL trident, cold and sharp. On the other side was a single word engraved in a clean, minimalist font: Observer. Maya didn't show the coin to anyone. She didn't put it on a shelf. She tucked it deep into her scrub pocket, a quiet, heavy reminder of the night that changed her perspective forever. She didn't need the world to know what she had done. She just needed to know that she was still the kind of person who refused to ignore what didn't add up. As she walked back onto the floor for her next shift, she saw a new trauma being wheeled in through the doors. A doctor was already shouting orders. The monitors were beeping. The chaos was starting all over again. Maya took a deep breath, adjusted her mask, and stepped into the fray. She was ready to move fast, yes, but more importantly, she was ready to see. In a society that celebrates speed, efficiency, and the hustle, we often overlook the people who choose to be meticulous. We value the disruptors and the fast movers, but we often forget the vital importance of the watchman, the person who stands at the gate and notices the small flickering lights on the horizon that the sensors miss. In the medical field, and indeed in almost every aspect of our modern life, there is a constant, grinding tension between the system and the individual. Systems are designed for the majority. They are built to handle the 99% with maximum speed and minimum friction. But we do not live in a world of averages. We live in a world of individuals, each with a story that is unique, messy, and often hidden behind a blank file. Maya's story is a tribute to the power of the observer. It's a reminder that true expertise isn't just about knowing all the standard answers. It's about having the courage to ask the right questions when the data feels empty. Many of the most tragic medical errors occur not because of a lack of knowledge, but because of a lack of attention. We get tired. We get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the world. We start to see the file instead of the man. We trust the digital readout over the human touch because it's easier and faster. But as the Navy SEAL discovered on that cold hospital floor, the difference between life and death is often found in the person who refuses to look away when the clock is ticking. This is the message for all of us. Regardless of our profession or our title, don't let the pressure of the system silence your inner intuition. Don't let the quest for speed blind you to the vital details. And never assume that because someone is new or lower in rank, that they aren't the ones seeing the truth that everyone else is too busy to catch. The Department of Defense didn't ask for the hospital's official accreditation or its efficiency ratings that morning. They didn't care about the throughput of the trauma bay. They asked one question: who made the call? They wanted to know who had the backbone to stand up and say, something isn't right here, and I won't move until I know why. In your own life, try to be the person who makes that call. Be the person who notices what doesn't add up, because your attention might be the only thing standing between someone and the darkness. They said she was a new nurse who didn't understand the necessary pace of the emergency room, but the truth wasn't found in her speed. It was in her absolute refusal to ignore the things that didn't fit the story. They asked who made the call, but the real answer wasn't a rank or a title. It was someone who refused to ignore what didn't add up.